Well, welcome to this week's Standing in the Rubble interview. You've got me this week instead of Adam, and I am so delighted to welcome my good friend, the amazing worship leader, anointed man that is Jamie Pritchard, who is a worship pastor at the Lantern in Poole. And we've got to know each other over the last year, I think, as part of a course that we've both been on together. Jamie is an amazing worship leader, a really wise guy, and a fantastic songwriter. And I would thoroughly recommend you check him out on Spotify and other platforms because his songs are great. So, Jamie, welcome.
Oh, thank you for having me. It's great to be with you. I'm really excited to be with you guys, Yeovil Community Church, and been down a couple of times and love everything about you guys. And yeah, I'm really excited for this discussion today.
So some of you will recognise Jamie from when Claire and I suddenly found ourselves with baby number 2, and I was unable to be around for Prayer Fest, and Jamie came over to step in and lead one evening, which was fantastic. So yeah, he is already connected with us as a church, and we love Jamie. So Jamie, I just wanted to start with, how has lockdown been for you?
Well, I think lockdown for me has been, I guess, like a lot of people, there's been some ups and there's been some downs. And I think at the start of lockdown, it was almost like this kind of almost slightly exciting. Like we're doing things a bit differently now. We're, had a lot more time freed up, and that was quite an exciting thing. And then I guess as it's gone on, really missing the just community elements and meeting with others. But overall, I think it's been almost a time of like pausing and reflecting on and being able to seek God and hear his voice over things that he's saying to the church and he's saying to myself. And so there's been ups, there's been downs, but it's been an interesting time if for anything else. So yeah.
And in your role, similar role to mine, a lot of that focuses around gatherings and the church service on a Sunday morning. We ended up staying live here and kind of doing church from different people's living rooms. How did you do that, and how did you navigate that as a church?
Yeah, so we did, well, we've been doing and still doing pre-recorded services throughout the week that myself and my wife Beth, who kind of oversees creative stuff here, have kind of been pulling together. And it's been really interesting and cool to see how God can work outside of time, and we've been kind of incorporating a live chat with that so that people can get the fellowship aspect, hopefully, of meeting together and being able to talk and pray for one another and stuff like that. So it's been a real learning curve for us, learning how to use video editing software and all of that kind of stuff. But we've been doing that kind of pre-recorded with elements from different people and kind of pulling that together.
Yeah, it's a very different season for those of us involved in the gathering of church, isn't it?
Absolutely.
So during this summer series, we're looking at the spiritual disciplines, formations, things that help us grow deeper with God. And the main reason for having you here is because of you as a worship leader and your experience in worship and passion for worship. So I guess if we just think about the spiritual discipline of worship, what would you say that is?
Yeah, it's a great question. And when you asked me to come and talk about this, I sort of looked up in the dictionary. I was like, okay, what is a discipline? What is the definition of a discipline? And in this context, it came up with this: to train oneself to do something in a controlled and habitual way. So it's train oneself to do something in a controlled and habitual way. And there's a great quote from Eugene Peterson about worship that Joe's probably heard. It's said a lot on our kind of worship pastor coaching track, and it says, I'm looking over there because I've actually got it on the wall, and it says, worship is the strategy by which we interrupt our preoccupation with ourselves and attend to the presence of God. So it's this idea that worship is like taking our eyes off ourselves and what's going on in our lives and how we may be feeling and all the things we come into a time of worship with, and lifting them onto God. And as I was kind of thinking about that, I guess it's a discipline because that doesn't just naturally happen, does it? It's like, it's not something that we will just happen if we don't choose for it to happen. And so, I was thinking that it's a discipline, because actually sometimes even we perhaps don't want to do that. We perhaps think, oh, I'd just rather not think about that right now. But actually the discipline of lifting our eyes off of ourselves and onto God, I think is something that is key for, not just for a Sunday morning when we come to church, but is key throughout our lives, because he is the one who is good and true and never changes. And so when so much, especially in this season, when so much is wavering and changing in front of us, to lift our eyes off of that and onto him, I think is so important for our mental health, our spiritual walk as well, to focus our mind on what is good and true and unchanging, and that's God. So I guess those are some of my sort of thoughts around the discipline of worship, I guess, particularly at the moment.
I'm grinning because I quoted the same thing to Adam when I had the conversation with him. Clearly, we've both been listening, so I think, Neil's going to be very impressed. So I think, one of my personal reflections in this season is like, obviously, we don't have the benefit of coming and gathering together as a whole. And personally, I find it way easier standing in a room full of, 50, 100, couple of hundred people, when we've all chosen to dedicate that moment to God. And there's an element of, we're doing this corporately together, and this is something that, we're here right now, and that is definitely something that I personally am missing during this. And I know that the pre-recorded worship's good. I know that people are able to then encounter God in their living rooms. I guess thinking less so about our reflection on the corporate, but more about like a personal worship life. How do you maintain a personal worship life, and how have you done that through these last months?
Yeah, well, I think you're totally right, and I think there's an element of worship that always is supposed to be corporate in that sense. And I love in Colossians where it says, teach and counsel one another with psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs. And it's like there's this element of, as we worship, we're encouraging each other, we're teaching and counseling one another. And actually, I think in this season, that side of worship has been kind of a challenge, but it has, like you said, taken us to this place where actually we really need to have just an on fire walk personally with God. We haven't got anything like that to rely on, where we're corporately gathering. And I think for me, it's kind of looked like, you've got all the practical things of maybe, putting worship on with no other worship music on, with no other agenda other than worshiping God, being with him, dwelling with him. I think carving out time to do that has been really important for me in this season, because even though maybe things, maybe you're furloughed or whatever it may be, and it seems like there's more time, we always seem to manage to fill that with other things. And it's so easy to jump onto the next job. But I've found starting every day in a place of worship, in that I'm trying to attend to God's presence and lift my eyes off myself and onto him. I found that really important at the start of each day. And also just trying to, we've tried it in different ways with little practical things of maybe setting an alarm each hour and just having that on my watch or something, and just having that as almost a trigger to be like, okay, let's just fix my eyes on God for a moment here and see what he's saying, see what things he's doing at the moment. And I for me, those kind of practical things really, really help me. But I think it's really kind of highlighted that need for a personal worship life with God in lockdown. And so I think, that all the elements of the spiritual disciplines, prayer and reading the word, they've all, and that's all kind of under the umbrella bracket of our life of worship. And so I think the spiritual disciplines, I think it's really cool that you guys are doing a series on it, because I think for me, the spiritual disciplines are something that has been so important, especially in this season, and kind of keeping a worship life going.
Yeah, I'd love to say my routine has been as disciplined as yours, but we've been juggling small children through lockdown. It's been a challenge. So I guess, okay, thinking then about, we've now got used to doing church in our pajamas or church, at home watching it. I think there's definitely some weeks when I find I'm really ready and I'm praising in my living room, and there's other weeks where it's definitely more of a spectator feeling for me. It's a bit of vulnerability there. How do you think COVID and this whole situation, everything we've been facing for these last months, is going to change church and the way that we worship?
Yeah, well, I can definitely relate to what you're saying there about kind of those times where you're watching church back, and especially when you've been involved, it's so easy to kind of pick pieces apart. But actually, I've found it a real struggle to engage, like you say. But I think that there's this sense that I'm getting that that almost the unshakable things are going to remain, and that everything that can be shaken off will be shaken off. And for me, I've really been enjoying and finding hope and peace and kind of the fullness of life that God promises us through worship in songs where Jesus is the focus. And don't get me wrong, I love songs that sing about our identity. Like I adore songs like that, but particularly in this season, I've really found that songs where we're just lifting our eyes again, as I say, like lifting our eyes onto Jesus. Some of the old songs that we've done for years, "In Christ Alone My Hope Is Found," all those kind of songs where we're just lifting our eyes off of our circumstances and onto Jesus. I've found that so helpful, and I wonder if perhaps that is something that God's doing in this kind of next season, is just bringing us back to a focus on Jesus, to just the simple gospel of Jesus dying for us on the cross and us finding our life in that place. And I think that songs that are kind of that kind of mold, I've really found massively helpful throughout lockdown. Yeah.
And how do you see, I guess, the return to physical church? What are you guys doing in Poole?
Well, we have started recording. So it was for the last few months. It's been me and my wife in our spare room with an acoustic guitar, quite stripped back, and then pulling people in to kind of add to that. But we've started recording a live worship band in church, pre-recording that. And I think that will be the way we're doing for a little while. But I think we're possibly looking at, moving to some kind of live streaming thing where we can maybe invite people that would struggle to log in with technology to a service perhaps, or where we can almost have a bit of a rotation of having a few people there, but being able to stream it out. But it's all, there's no sort of hard and fast plans put in as yet.
There's a lot of uncertainty, isn't there, and a lot of unknown. Yeah. And I think the part that personally, I'm reflecting on is the guidelines about not corporately singing, and that's obviously such a significant part of what we do, but also a significant part of what we do when we gather. And I think it'll be really interesting to see how church evolves and how we do the gathering together. I know for us, we're going to maintain live streaming long term. That's just what we're going to do now forever. So I imagine that will be something that we, will continue to meet people online in that way. But yeah, I think it's changed everything in the way that we gather. And at the moment, I struggle to imagine and see a time where we will gather like we used to, and gather how what we know as church. And that's quite an interesting place to be, isn't it?
Yeah, and I guess being vulnerable, that's quite almost a daunting thing as well, to think, actually, is it going to happen again like it used to? Like, are we going to get together and lift our voices together and do all those things that we're used to? But Yeah, I think I'm excited to see what God brings about out of it. You know, how He can turn it for good. But like you say, at the moment, we're in this kind of in between state of, you know, how is this going to look? We've got no idea. You know, we did a prayer night the other night, and I led a bit of worship, but I was the only one that could sing, and so that feels, you know, quite strange, but almost I've kind of noticed that it's almost like in the Psalms where you have a chunk of text, and then it will say like Selah, you know, where in the little, or in some Bibles it will say interlude, and that kind of word it means a musical interlude, but it also means a pause to weigh what you've just sung and reflect on the words you've just sung. And I'm finding that we've done that a couple of times in life group, or like gathering to pray with people, that we've had a time of worship where only one person can sing, and it's almost like there's such, like, people are really fixing themselves on what they're singing so much more, and it's almost becoming a bit of a deeper revelation of what it is they're actually singing. And so I think that's some of the ways that we're starting to see God turn a situation where we can't sing together for good, but I'm excited to see what else happens.
And are there any like verses or passages that have been particularly standing out to you right now, either on worship or actually just in your own journey?
Yeah. Well, yeah, I've been thinking quite a lot about thankfulness over lockdown. And I spoke to someone who kind of is a bit of an expert in kind of, I guess, psychology, but from a Christian perspective. And she was saying that a thankful thought, a 15 to 20-second thankful thought, can kind of change your physiology and change the way you think and renew your mind. And I've been thinking about that link of thankfulness and worship, and how, like, I've got a couple of Psalms here that I've really that it's really stuck out to me from. So like Psalm 100 verses 4-5 says, "Enter his gates with thanksgiving and his courts with praise. Give thanks to him and praise his name. For the Lord is good and his love endures forever. His faithfulness continues through all generations." And I was really struck by during New Wine Breaks Out, the morning sessions in the arena, I think, were labelled it was I forget the first part, but it was in an age of anxiety. And I kind of think I see that a lot, and you know, I noticed that in myself. That's something that I find quite easy to fall into, being anxious about things. And I was kind of thinking of this link between thankfulness and worship. And, you know, in Philippians 4, it says, "Do not be anxious about anything, but in every situation, with prayer and petition and with thanksgiving, present your requests to God, and the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your hearts and mind in Christ Jesus." And I've just noticed how, when we look at the Psalms, throughout the Psalms, this thankfulness and praise seem to be like together as one thing. And I've just been thinking about how the practice of thankfulness is core to worship, and actually how, as we do that, as we choose to be thankful for God's given us, and focus on that, it's almost like that peace that transcends all understanding comes. And so I think in lockdown, when I think anxiety is probably fairly high, I don't know about that for your community, but I can certainly relate to that in my life and in our community here. It seems that actually worship and thankfulness is a real antidote to that. And I've just been kind of thinking about that and trying to practice that. And we've been doing this series, John Mark Comer, off his book, The Ruthless Elimination of Hurry. And he says gratitude ferments worship, which is a very cool way of saying it. But that's kind of what I've been thinking about, how actually just being thankful for what we've given, like, kind of it does exactly that. It ferments worship. It almost lets worship bubble up and rise up in us, and that is not only because God's worthy of it that we should do it, because that, I think that's kind of the primary reason for worship, that God is worthy of it. but actually I just find it amazing that in us giving him worship because he's worthy, there's like a transaction, and it kind of he brings about that peace. And so I think that's kind of some of the things that I've been thinking about in anxiety in lockdown, about anxiety and worship and thankfulness, and how that all kind of links together.
Yeah, I love that. We were pairing worship with gratitude for this one, and I think you're so right. And in how we come into God's presence and how we do that, but even just the act of practicing gratitude shifts and transforms the way we think. So just then, as a finishing point, if somebody is sat there, they're seeing this or hearing this and going, actually, I feel like I need to make a change there, or actually going, maybe they're suffering with anxiety right now, and actually a shift to gratitude would be a really healthy and helpful thing to start practicing. Have you got any practical tips on something that you do, or how people could give that a go during this time?
I think the thanking, just taking the time to thank God for the blessings in our lives. And I think even when I've felt like, oh, nothing's going right, if I sit down and go, okay, I'm going to think through my life and think of what I can be thankful for. What can I say thank you to God for? I find it's almost like a snowball effect. So I would encourage people just to kind of take the time to think of something that they can give God praise for, that they can say, thank you, God, for this in my life. I'm so grateful to you for it. And as I find that as you start, it snowballs. And so I would just encourage people just to start thanking God, whether it's the fact that there's petrol in the car. Thank God that there's petrol in the car. Whether it could be a tiny thing or it could be a massive thing, but just start somewhere. And I think allow the Spirit of God to kind of work in you, and that will start to snowball.
Mate, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for your thoughts and for your inspiration. And really, really helpful thoughts there, particularly there about how we can practice gratitude and those and that rhythm in our own lives. So thank you so much. See you soon.
Pleasure. Thanks for having me.